Claire sat in her bedroom, her back pressed against the door, the chair still wedged tightly under the handle. The journal lay open on her lap, and her flashlight flickered weakly, the light barely pushing back the shadows that seemed to grow darker with each passing second. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was heavy, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. She flipped through the pages of the journal again, her eyes scanning the frantic handwriting for anything that could help her. Most of it was disjointed, ramblings about shadows and voices, but one passage caught her attention. The door in the hallway leads to the heart of the house. It's where it started. Where it always starts. If you're brave enough to face it, the truth is there. But so is the house. Her hands trembled as she read the words. The door at the end of the hallway. She had been there earlier, but now, the thought of going back sent a chill down her spine. A sudden sound broke the silence, a low, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the hallway, just outside her door. Tap, tap, tap. Claire's heart raced. She turned off the flashlight, plunging herself into darkness. Maybe if she stayed quiet, whatever it was would go away. She held her breath, straining to hear. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped altogether. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps against her bedroom door. Claire froze. Her hands tightened around the journal, her mind racing. She didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound, but the door handle rattled, testing the lock. Her voice was barely a whisper. Who's there? No response. The handle rattled again, harder this time. Claire scrambled to her feet, clutching the journal like a shield. The chair under the doorknob creaked, the wood groaning under the strain. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Claire pressed her ear to the door, her breath shallow. The hallway was silent. She waited for what felt like an eternity, but the stillness didn't break. Finally, she gathered the courage to remove the chair and unlock the door. She opened it a crack, her flashlight in hand, and peered into the hallway. It was empty, but the air felt colder, heavier, as if something had just been there. Her flashlight beam landed on the floor, and her stomach twisted. The trail of blood had returned, thicker now, and it led straight to the door at the end of the hallway. Claire hesitated. Every part of her screamed to go back to her room, to lock the door and wait for morning. But the words from the journal echoed in her mind. If you're brave enough to face it, the truth is there. She took a step forward, then another. Her footsteps were barely audible on the wooden floor, but the house seemed to amplify every creak and groan. The door loomed closer, its strange carvings catching the faint light from her flashlight. The scratches on its surface seemed deeper now, more deliberate. When she reached it, she stopped. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her breath shaky. She could feel the cold radiating from the door, as if whatever was behind it was alive. Gathering every ounce of courage, Claire turned the handle. The door swung open slowly, revealing a dark staircase leading downward. The air that drifted up was damp and stale, carrying a metallic smell that made her stomach churn. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. No response. She shone her flashlight down the stairs. The beam barely reached the bottom, but she could make out the shape of another door, smaller and simpler than the first. Claire's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move. The wooden steps groaned under her weight, each one sounding louder than the last. When she reached the bottom, she saw the smaller door was slightly ajar. Faint light spilled out from the crack, flickering like candlelight. Pushing the door open, Claire stepped inside. The room was small and circular, with walls covered in symbols she didn't recognize. In the center was a table, and on it sat an old, rusted box. The air felt thick, almost alive, as if the room itself was watching her. Her hands trembled as she approached the table. The box was sealed with a heavy lock, but the moment she touched it, the whispers started again. They were louder this time, clearer, as if they were all around her. One voice stood out among the others. Low, guttural, and unmistakable. Claire. Her name echoed in the small room, and the temperature plummeted. Her breath came out in visible puffs as she stepped back from the table. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, growing darker, deeper. A figure began to form, barely visible in the flickering light. "Claire," the voice said again, closer now. She stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering wildly. The figure moved toward her, its shape indistinct but menacing. Panic surged through her. She turned and ran, bolting up the stairs as fast as her legs would carry her. The whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic. When she reached the top, she slammed the door shut and locked it, her chest heaving. The whispers stopped. Claire leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath. But when she looked down at her hands, she froze. Her fingers were smeared with something dark and sticky. Blood. Claire stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The blood on her hands was warm, sticky, and very real. It wasn't just her imagination. It wasn't a dream. Something had followed her. She wiped her trembling hands on her shirt, her mind racing. She had locked the door behind her, but she didn't feel safe. The air was heavy, pressing down on her like a weight. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse. Slowly, she turned to face the hallway. The trail of blood was still there, leading away from the basement door, weaving across the wooden floor. Her flashlight flickered again, and for a brief second, the hallway went completely dark. When the light came back, her heart stopped. The blood trail was gone. Claire staggered back, her body trembling. It had been there. She had seen it. She had followed it. But now, the floor was spotless, as if nothing had ever happened. She forced herself to move, her legs unsteady as she hurried back to her bedroom. She slammed the door shut, locked it, and shoved the chair back under the handle. She needed to think. The journal. Claire pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The door had creaked open, but nothing stepped inside. The darkness beyond the doorway seemed alive, pulsing with an unnatural presence. Then, the air shifted. A sudden icy gust swept through the room, sending shivers down Claire's spine. The flashlight flickered wildly in her trembling grip. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body refused to move. Then she saw it. A figure stood just beyond the threshold, barely distinguishable from the surrounding shadows. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the dim light. But then, it moved. The figure stepped forward, and Claire's stomach twisted. It was tall, its body unnaturally thin, draped in what looked like tattered remnants of clothing. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a hollow void, shifting and writhing like smoke. Claire let out a strangled gasp, stepping back until her back hit the wall. The entity cocked its head, as if studying her. Then, in a voice that sent ice through her veins, it whispered, "You see me now." The words echoed in her mind, crawling under her skin. It wasn't just a voice, it was a feeling, pressing against her like invisible hands. Claire clutched the journal against her chest. The entries had warned about this. About the whispers. About the house feeding on fear. She tried to steady her voice. "What are you?" The figure took another step forward. The air between them became heavy, thick, suffocating. "I am the echo," it murmured. "I am what remains." Suddenly, the walls seemed to close in. The room stretched unnaturally, the furniture warping and twisting. The light from the flashlight dimmed, as if the darkness itself was swallowing it. Then, the whispering returned. Not just one voice, but many. A chorus of soft, sinister murmurs surrounded Claire, filling her ears with unintelligible words. The entity reached out. Claire felt her body go rigid as something unseen coiled around her throat, cold, pressing, suffocating. She couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed at her to fight. She thrashed, her fingers clawing at the invisible force choking her. The journal slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The moment it touched the ground, the whispers faltered. The grip on her throat loosened just slightly. Instinct took over. Claire lunged for the journal, flipping through the pages with shaking fingers. There had to be something to stop this thing. Then, her eyes locked onto a passage. The ink was smeared, but the words were clear. It fears the name. With the last of her breath, she forced out the words. Sarah! The entity recoiled violently. The room shuddered, the walls cracking as if the house itself was screaming. The whispers stopped. The figure staggered backward, its form flickering. For the first time, Claire saw something else within the shifting void, a glimpse of a woman's face. Then, with a final, distorted shriek, the spirit vanished. The room fell silent. Claire collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Her throat ached, her body trembled, but she was alive. She had seen it. It had seen her. And it wasn't going to stop. The house was eerily silent. The encounter with the entity had left Claire shaken, her hands still trembling as she clutched the journal. It had responded to Sarah's name, had recoiled from it. That meant something. It meant Sarah was the key. Claire swallowed hard and turned back to the journal, flipping through the fragile, yellowed pages. If Sarah had left behind her name as a weapon, maybe she had left something else. A clue. A way out. She read carefully, skimming over frantic, half-legible passages. Then, something caught her eye. The truth is buried where the past still lingers. Beneath the eye that watches, behind the weight of time. Claire frowned, mouthing the words to herself. It sounded like a riddle. She read it again. Buried where the past still lingers. That had to mean something in the house. Somewhere old, untouched. Then she saw it, scrawled in the margin, barely visible. A single word. Parlor. Claire's pulse quickened. The parlor was one of the oldest rooms in the house. She had barely stepped inside since she arrived. Gripping the flashlight, she forced herself to move. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she stepped cautiously into the hallway. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, but she pressed on, keeping her focus on the end of the hall. The parlor door loomed ahead. It was one of the few doors in the house that had remained locked, until now. The knob turned easily in her hand. She hesitated, taking a deep breath before pushing it open. The parlor was cold, the air thick with dust and the scent of aged wood. Heavy furniture sat undisturbed, covered in sheets, their shapes like silent, waiting figures. A grand fireplace stood against the far wall, its marble mantel cracked with age. And above it, a portrait. It was massive, the frame heavy and ornate. The painting depicted a stern-looking man with piercing dark eyes, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. His gaze felt almost alive, watching her. Beneath the eye that watches. Claire's heartbeat pounded. Could it mean the portrait? She stepped closer, the floor groaning beneath her. The painting's surface was faded, but the man's expression was sharp, as if daring her to look deeper. Her fingers brushed the frame, feeling along the edges. Then, her hand stopped. A gap. Without thinking, she pushed. The portrait swung forward with a click, revealing a hollow space behind it. Claire's breath caught. Inside the hidden compartment was an old wooden box, its lid etched with strange symbols. Dust covered its surface, but as she reached for it, a wave of unease settled over her. Something was here. The air grew colder. The whispers started again. Claire spun around, her flashlight flickering. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, stretching unnaturally toward her. She grabbed the box and stumbled backward. The whispering grew louder, pressing into her skull like 1,000 unseen voices. The door to the parlor slammed shut on its own. Claire's heart raced. She turned back to the portrait. The man's painted eyes seemed different now, sharper, darker. And then, for the briefest moment, they blinked. Claire gasped and bolted for the door, the box clutched tightly in her hands. She twisted the knob, yanking it open just in time to hear a distorted voice hiss behind her. "You shouldn't have found it." She didn't stop running. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted up the stairs, the wooden box clutched tightly in her hands. The whispers had followed her, slithering through the halls like unseen serpents. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She burst into her room, slamming the door shut behind her. Her trembling fingers locked it, though deep down, she knew it wouldn't keep it out. She collapsed onto the floor, the box resting in her lap. Its surface was covered in strange carvings, symbols she didn't recognize. She wiped the sweat from her brow and carefully pried it open. Inside was a bundle of aged papers, brittle with time. At the very top was an old, faded photograph. Claire's stomach dropped. It was a picture of Sarah. She looked younger, her face frozen in an expression of fear. But there was something else, something behind her. Claire squinted at the image. A dark shape loomed in the background, barely visible in the grainy photograph. The longer she stared, the more it seemed to shift, like it was alive. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the papers beneath the photo. It was a letter, written in Sarah's frantic handwriting. "If you are reading this, it means the house has not let you go. It means you've seen it, heard it. It means it has chosen you, just as it chose me." Claire's pulse pounded in her ears. "I tried to stop it. I tried to break free. But the house doesn't let go. It feeds on fear. It waits for the right moment to take what it wants." A sharp thud echoed from the hallway. Claire's head snapped up. Another thud, closer this time. Her breath hitched. She scrambled to her feet, pressing her back against the door. The whispering returned. But this time, it wasn't just words. It was her name. Claire. Her body went cold. Then, the doorknob twisted. Slowly, deliberately. Claire stumbled backward, clutching the letter like a lifeline. She needed to do something. Now. Her eyes darted back to the journal, Sarah's words burning in her mind. "The house feeds on fear. It watches. It waits. Don't let it in." She clenched her fists. No more running. Claire grabbed the flashlight and turned to the door. "If you want me," she whispered, "come and get me." The whispering stopped. Silence stretched through the house. Then, the door exploded open. A gust of icy wind slammed into her, knocking her backward. The lights flickered wildly, casting twisting shadows along the walls. And there, standing in the doorway, the figure was tall, its body cloaked in writhing darkness. Hollow, empty eyes stared at her, bottomless pits of hunger. Its mouth twisted open, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Claire's breath hitched. It stepped forward. She scrambled back, gripping the journal in one hand and Sarah's letter in the other. Then she saw it. The box. The carvings. A desperate idea formed in her mind. Claire grabbed the wooden box and held it up. "You don't want me," she gasped. "You want this." The creature froze. For the first time, the whispering stopped. The air went deathly still. Claire's grip tightened on the box. "This is what you've been hiding, isn't it?" Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to keep going. "Sarah tried to stop you. She left this behind to finish what she started." The creature let out a guttural hiss, its body convulsing. The shadows around it flickered violently. Claire took a step forward. "If you want it so badly," she whispered, "come and take it." The entity let out a shriek, a deafening, unearthly wail that rattled the walls. The house shook beneath her feet. The darkness swirled, closing in. Claire's heart pounded. Then, with every ounce of strength she had left, she did the only thing she could. She opened the box. A blinding light erupted from within, flooding the room. The entity screamed, its form writhing and twisting. The shadows recoiled, pulling away as the light consumed them. The walls trembled. The whispers turned to wails. And then, everything went still. Claire's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She was on the floor, the box resting beside her. The air was heavy with silence. The entity was gone. But something felt wrong. She looked down at the journal, her fingers trembling as she flipped to the final page. One last message was scrawled in Sarah's shaky handwriting. You may have won the battle, but the house never loses. A chill ran down Claire's spine, because outside her door, something whispered her name. Claire's hands shook as she slammed the wooden box shut. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. But the silence that followed was worse than the screaming. The entity was gone. Or at least, it had retreated. She forced herself to stand, her legs weak beneath her. The room was eerily still, but the air remained thick with something unseen. Then, her gaze fell on the floor. The blood. It was back. A trail of it, leading out of her room and down the hallway. Claire swallowed hard. She had to know where it led. Clutching the box tightly, she stepped forward, her bare feet sticking slightly to the wooden floor. The house seemed darker now, heavier, like it was breathing around her. She followed the crimson path down the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The blood trail twisted through the hallway, leading her toward the study, the room where she had first found Sarah's journal. The door was slightly ajar. She hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn back. But she had come too far. With a deep breath, Claire pushed the door open. The study looked different. The bookshelves loomed taller, the walls stretched further, as if the room itself had shifted. At the center of it all, resting on the old wooden desk, was a small, rusted key. Claire's fingers hovered over it. She knew what this was. The final piece. The key to the real treasure. She snatched it up, ignoring the cold sting it left against her skin. Then, the whispers returned. Soft at first, then growing, surrounding her. She spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the dark. The shadows moved, shifting along the walls like living things. A single voice broke through the noise. Don't open it. Claire's breath hitched. It was Sarah's voice. She turned sharply, expecting to see her, but the room was empty. Her grip tightened around the key. Sarah had tried to stop the house. She had failed. But Claire had come too far to back down now. She bolted from the study, key in hand, heart hammering. The house reacted, the very walls groaning as if it could feel what she was about to do. Claire didn't care. She ran to the basement. The door was closed, but she shoved it open without hesitation. The darkness swallowed her, but she pressed forward, descending the creaking steps. At the bottom, she found it. The old, rusted chest. It sat against the far wall, half buried beneath dust and time. The carvings on its surface were similar to those on the wooden box, symbols etched deep into the metal. This was it. She knelt before it, key trembling in her hand. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, she pushed the key into the lock and turned it. A loud click echoed through the basement. The whispers stopped. Claire held her breath and slowly lifted the lid. At first, she didn't understand what she was seeing. Inside the chest wasn't gold, jewels, or ancient artifacts. It was black, crumbling paper. Dozens of fragile, brittle sheets, stacked neatly on top of one another. Some were torn, their ink faded beyond recognition. Others were covered in symbols she couldn't understand. Claire frowned, carefully picking up one of the sheets. It felt delicate, like it might turn to dust in her hands. This wasn't treasure. This was something else. Something forgotten. She flipped through the pages, heart pounding. And then she saw it. A name. Her own. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the paper, stumbling backward, her pulse thundering in her ears. The air shifted. Claire's breath came in shallow gasps as she felt something behind her. She turned, and the entity was there, closer than ever, towering over her. Its hollow eyes burned into hers, its jagged mouth twisting into something almost like a smile. Then, in a voice that sent ice through her veins, it whispered, "You should have left." Darkness swallowed the room. Darkness swallowed everything. Claire couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very walls of the basement were pressing in on her. Then, a flicker of light. Not from her flashlight. That had long since died. This glow was faint, eerie, coming from the chest. Claire's heart pounded as she looked down. The brittle papers were no longer crumbling. The ink had shifted, swirling across the pages, rewriting itself in real time. More words. More names. Her hands trembled as she reached for the top sheet. Her own name was still there. But beneath it, something had been added. Claire Thompson, marked. A chill crawled up her spine. No, this wasn't right. The chest was supposed to hold treasure, answers, freedom. But instead, it held a record. A ledger. She flipped through the pages, faster now, her breath coming in short gasps. Name after name. All marked. All trapped. The realization struck her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was a prison. And she had just signed herself in. A slow creaking sound made her snap her head up. The entity was still there. Watching. Waiting. It had no eyes, no true form, just shifting darkness shaped into something almost human. But Claire could feel it. She was part of this now. She stumbled back, gripping the paper so tightly it crumpled in her fist. "No," she whispered. "No, I don't belong here." The shadows laughed. A low, guttural sound that rumbled through the basement like an earthquake. The door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, trapping her inside. Claire ran for it anyway, pounding on the wood, screaming for help. But deep down, she knew, no one would hear her, just like no one had heard Sarah, or the others. Tears burned her eyes as she pressed her forehead against the door. "Please," she begged, "let me go." Silence. Then, a whisper. "The house keeps what it takes." Claire squeezed her eyes shut. No. She wouldn't end like this. She wouldn't let the house win. Her mind raced, grasping for anything that could save her. The papers. The chest. Sarah's journal. The journal. Claire spun around, scanning the darkness until she spotted it, lying where she had dropped it earlier. She lunged for it, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. Sarah had tried to leave. She had failed. But what if? Claire's breath caught as she reached the final, unfinished page. The house is alive. It feeds on fear. It wants you to believe there's no escape. But there is. There has to be. I just have to. The sentence stopped there. Sarah never finished it. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears. The house fed on fear. But what if she stopped feeding it? She turned slowly, her whole body shaking. The entity was still there, watching, waiting, testing her. Claire took a deep breath. Then, with every ounce of willpower she had left, she dropped the journal, dropped the papers, dropped everything, and stepped toward the entity. It didn't move, didn't react. It only loomed, as if uncertain. Claire swallowed hard and spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not afraid of you." The air shifted. The walls groaned. The house shuddered. For the first time, Claire saw something in the entity's form, hesitation. She took another step forward. You don't control me. A crack split through the air, like something tearing open. The whispers screamed. Claire clenched her fists, refusing to look away. And then, everything collapsed. A blinding flash of light. A rush of cold air. The feeling of falling. And then, nothing. Silence. Claire's eyes fluttered open. She was lying on the grass. The house was gone. No ruins. No debris. No sign it had ever existed. The sky stretched endlessly above her, the first hints of dawn breaking over the horizon. She pushed herself up, her body aching. The journal was gone. The papers were gone. The entity was gone. But she was alive. She had escaped. Or at least, that's what she thought. Until she looked at her hands, carved into her skin, faint but undeniable. A single word. Marked. Claire's breath hitched. She was free. But the house wasn't done with her yet.